Hi, class. We're going to continue our discussion on short fiction. We're going to be focusing on an article in the reading list called The Three Types of Short Stories. We're going to be talking about the first two, not because the last one is unimportant, but I find that those first two are really kind of the most common in my perspective. And also, I think that if we look at the differences between the two, it can make us understand them better. So let's start with the first one first. So let's talk about epics. Well, when you hear this word epic, like me, I normally think of like, oh, Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, like these giant, sprawling stories that are told over many, many years, or they're just really, really long, like the Lord of the Rings. While that's true, obviously, that those are epics, if we look at the definition, that the rest of the definition of epic, it says usually centered upon a hero or a protagonist, and in which a series of great achievements or events is narrated in an elevated style. So, in this article, they talk a lot about the work of the modernists. And so, when we're talking about the modernists, we're looking at like the early 20th century writers, and for them, at the end of these stories, the short fiction, there's always this idea of having an epiphany, right? Getting to some clarity about something. So whether in Joyce it might be, childhood or adulthood, or whatever the case may be, that there's this idea of like, oh, it's all kind of progressing to some sort of epiphany. And so if you think about it from that perspective, that's how it's sort of epic, right? Where it's this grand sort of narrative, we're told in this grand sort of way. And so I think the modernists kind of, at least when I was an undergrad, kind of solidified in my head that, oh, like a short story by definition must be this type of short story. Obviously this is the wrong way of thinking about it, but it just sort of ingrained in it in my mind like all short stories should be this type of epiphany type of short stories where there's some sort of realization at the end. And in many ways, I don't know if I've ever broken that sort of train of thinking, um, but it's not entirely true, right? There's other types of stories, and we'll talk about them in a moment. But this, I think, is a very common type of short story or short fiction, where there's this sort of epiphany at the end. And like I said, it goes back to the modernists, and since they have such an overwhelming sort of influence on short fiction, I think it kind of makes sense that this becomes kind of ingrained in our sense of what a story is. And so, if we're thinking about these types of stories, the reason why I think it relates to this idea of epic is this idea of that the accomplishments, the great accomplishments that the protagonist is doing is kind of working toward this epiphany. And so the difference here is that in these stories, they're kind of about real life, so it's not like the character is like going and getting the sword and then slaying the dragon and then winning, saving the day. In that sense, it's a more of a sort of real life approach to slaying the dragon. So, what's the metaphorical sword that you need to slay that metaphorical problem that you have in your life in order to achieve what you want to achieve? Um, and so, if you're at all familiar with Jung or Joseph Campbell, this might seem really familiar to you, this type of epic story, where Joseph Campbell talks about the monomyth or the sort of the hero's journey in a way, where the hero starts out and they have like a quest or they want to go on a quest. So Star Wars is kind of the sort of prototypical monomyth where Luke Skywalker, wants to get off his planet, wants to go adventure, and he's given the opportunity. He refuses the call, and he finds a mentor. Then they go into this other world. Then they, slay the dragon, or blow up the Death Star in that case, save the princess type thing. This type of story is very similar. It's going to look very different. That the sword that you need to find or the mentor, they're not going to be this bearded old man in the desert or wherever the bearded old man resides, could be Hogwarts, that it's going to be maybe it's going to look totally different. But I think it's the same beats, and so I think when we look at these epic stories, they share the same beats of the epic, tales. They're just going to look kind of completely different, and so instead of winning the princess or saving the day, it's getting to the epiphany, if that makes sense. Now, the lyric stories are going to be a little bit different because, as it talks about here, instead of focusing on plot, the lyrical short story is distinguished by its emphasis on a central recurring image or symbol around which the narrative revolves and from which it acquires an open and flexible meaning. So here, when you're thinking about this, it's a lot, it's a kind of opposed to, in a way, having a sense of closure. And it's not that the story itself or the images in the story are just kind of meaningless, but they're open to interpretation, where there's a lot more flexibility. So, for instance, in the epic stories that we were talking about, the epiphany that the characters reach at the end is pretty fixed, meaning that it's clear that the reader, the protagonist, is having this particular epiphany, right? That they're having an epiphany about childhood or adulthood, or coming from a childhood to adulthood, or whatever it may be, or that they're winning or saving the day, right? In this, it's not going to be as closed, right? That the hero's journey is not going to just end at the thing here. It's going to be more open-ended, both in terms of plot and also meaning. And so that's why I was saying that there's a lot of differences here. So if you're thinking about the previous type of stories, as they mention in the first sentence, there's a decisive ending, and there's this universal insight. There's this sort of like, oh, here's what we are trying to say about childhood or whatever it is. And so when you're looking at these different types of stories, obviously these are both two types of stories that we're going to be seeing a lot in this class. And if you're thinking about in terms of short fiction, I think it would be interesting kind of when you're analyzing and reading the short fiction in this class is to kind of think about it from maybe these two types of perspectives of like, what is the author going for? Is the author going for this sort of definite journey where at the end of this journey the character is winning the prize or saving the day or gaining an epiphany? Or is it a little bit maybe more open-ended? And when I think of the word lyrical, I think of course, lyrics. And if you think about lyrics to a song, they're really open for interpretation. And you can put a lot of your own ideas and kind of fill in the gaps and paint with the song lyrics. Whereas in the epic, it's going to be a lot more explicit, right? And so that's going to be something interesting, I think, when you're kind of comparing the two types of fiction, is to kind of think of like, oh, well, which way is this leaning toward? And so when we get to week 2 for the essay, one of the things you could do is analyze Telltale Heart through the lens of what we've learned throughout the class in the first 2 weeks. And this is maybe something you could do and think about is Poe, the author, creating a more of a sort of epiphany, like, like epic type of story as we've been talking about, or is it more lyrical in nature? And so that would be something interesting and maybe to kind of wrap your head around. And so if you want to talk more about these, obviously we could do so on the discussion boards or in the Ask the Instructor area, or via email or phone if that's something you prefer. But I just want to take some time to go here. I will also link to the hero's journey because kind of looking back at it now as I'm just thinking back on the video, I don't know if I explained it well enough. And so I don't want to go into too much detail because obviously that's just like a whole nother discussion. But I'll just kind of link a sort of a diagram of the hero's journey, so you don't think I'm a crazy person. Okay. The reason I think I just brought it up is I think it's really a good way of understanding how sort of these epiphany or epic stories work in terms of character, setting out on a quest, achieving certain things along the way, great achievements, and then, saving the day or saving the princess or whatever it is at the end, or the epiphany. All right. Well, have a great week, and I'm looking forward to the rest of this class, and I'll see you in week 2. Bye.